Good afternoon. My name is Dr. John King. I'm a professor of tree physiology in the College of Natural Resources at North Carolina State University. One of the things we study in my lab is bioenergy in North Carolina, and in particular, bioenergy from trees. Today we're at what we call the Bioenergy Research experimental field, and in collaboration with the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services and North Carolina Bioenergy Research Initiative, we're conducting experiments testing the potential to use American sycamore as what we call a feedstock for bioenergy production in North Carolina. So what is bioenergy? I like to think about it, we're all familiar with solar panels as being collectors of solar energy and converting that into electricity. Well, when I see the canopy of the forest, all the leaves on all the trees, I think of that as my solar collector. And that's exactly what trees are doing. They're collecting energy from the sun with their leaves, and then they're converting that energy into sugars, and then from the sugars into wood. And when we think of that wood, that's energy that's in a long-term storage form produced for us by trees. That's one of the services that forests do for us. And then we can use that energy, for example, to make a fire and cook our food, or we can use it to heat our homes. And so that's a very direct example of converting solar energy into chemical energy that we can then convert back into heat for whatever purpose we have. So trees are really ideal for producing bioenergy. Okay, so within that, we're looking at American sycamore at this Butner Bioenergy Research site. And we want to talk about how we're trying to figure out the best way to grow sycamore for bioenergy and how productive it is. Because when we think about developing new bioenergy markets in North Carolina, we want to think about it in the context of other land uses in North Carolina. For example, if we ask a farmer to consider growing American sycamore for energy, he's probably going to wonder how much money he can make off of American sycamore relative to corn or soybeans, something he's more used to. And so in this research experiment and others across the state, we plant American sycamore at varying planting densities, and then we quantify how productive it is. And then once we know the productivity, how many tons per acre per year we can produce, we know the price of pulpwood, and that can allow us to estimate the economic return on growing sycamore as a bioenergy crop. Then we can present that information in terms that the farmers can consider in the context of their operations. And this is our research field site. And at this site, we're growing American sycamore, which is a native species to the southeastern U.S. And we're testing it for its potential as a bioenergy crop. And when we think about using trees in a bioenergy system, we have to manage them on what we call a short rotation. So typically, for example, with loblolly pine, to produce saw timber, we manage that on a 25-year rotation, right? We plant the trees, and then we come back 25 years later and harvest those trees and convert them into lumber. In the case of energy, we want to be on a much shorter time scale, and so we call that short rotation coppice culture. And we do that on a 3 to 5 year time scale. And the coppice part is interesting. Some hardwood trees, when you cut them down, they will sprout out. Many people have seen that. They will sprout back, and then they can produce another crop of trees. And that's exactly what we do with these American sycamore. So we plant these trees at about 2,000 trees to the acre, and then we let them grow for anywhere from 3 to 5 years. It seems like 3 is the optimal time period. And then we harvest those trees, and we let those coppice or resprout back naturally. So one of the benefits of working with hardwood species, and in particular American sycamore, is that we only plant it one time, and then we can come back and get a crop off of it every 3 years. And so in an agricultural setting, we might think about putting in some fields into American sycamore, short rotation coppice, for maybe a period of 10 to 12 years. And during that time, the farmer will get 3 or 4 harvests. Okay? So that's the idea. And so the farmer would incur planting expenses only one time during that 12 years. and establishment costs. So we might plant the field with sycamore seedlings at about 2,000 trees to the acre at a given spacing that works with agricultural machinery so that he can still tend the land afterwards. We would apply a little bit of herbicide to knock out the agricultural weeds that first year. And after that, that's it. We walk away. The trees grow. We come back 3 years later and we harvest those trees, and then they just sprout back naturally, or coppicing. And we can show you some examples of that coppicing today. We'll show you what some coppice tree stumps look like and regeneration. You can see here in this case, we cut this tree last April 2019, and it was probably 2 or 3 large stems at that point in time because it had actually been harvested 3 years or 4 years prior to that. But now you can see it has probably 20 or 25 stems that have sprouted back. And some of those stems are larger than others. And these ones that are large are basically outcompeting the others, and they will continue to do so until this thing self-thins down to maybe 2 or 3 large stems. And that's what the farmer will harvest after about 3 years. You could let it go for 5 years, but we found that if you let it go that long, the trees get to be a little bit too large and hard to handle. So 3 years is probably the optimum time.
Good afternoon. My name is Omoyeme Jennifer Ile. I'm a master's student in the lab of Dr. John King, and it's the Tree Physiology and Ecosystem Lab. So like he already talked about, our research here is on American sycamore. We looked at the productivity of American sycamore as a bioenergy feedstock, and then we also want to look at how this possibility of improving agricultural soils. So for my research, I looked at the productivity of American sycamore feedstock, and then I looked at how it had improved soil properties here. So we have the root system below ground, so this adds like organic carbon to the soil. We have earthworms also moving on below ground. We have some other organisms moving below ground, and all these are like biological activities that help to improve soil and then add organic carbon to the soil. And another thing that's particular with American sycamore is the leaf area index of American sycamore. That's wild leaves, and then when you have a lot of it on the ground, on your field, it also helps to add carbon into the soil, and also helps in all the organism activities below ground. So I looked at some properties, some basic soil properties. I looked at aggregate stability, I looked at water retention properties, I looked at air porosity. So what we found out was that the high spacing in our sites, which is what we recommend for bioenergy, they showed positive results in giving us macro aggregates, and those are a bigger aggregate structure of soil, and we want that for our soil so that when you have tractors moving in your agricultural soil, you don't easily break your aggregates stability. And then we also you want to have good water retention properties. You want to have big pores in your soil below ground for water movement, for air movement, for gas exchange, for nutrient exchange, and all of that. So we found that our trees here have the potential to provide that, and which we think that when we incorporate these trees on agricultural field, they're also going to help in improving the agricultural soils. When you want to have good aggregate stability, good structure, because when they form like when they form you have so many of this in the soil below ground, right? So when you have them in macro aggregates and them forming, you have pores around the aggregates, you have spaces, and this allows for water movement, allows for air movement and gas exchange. So you want to have your aggregates well structured so you can allow for all these good things to happen beneath your soil. A specific benefit of American sycamore, like Dr. King talked about, we talked about you don't have to use herbicides after the first time of establishing your trees at this wide leaf area index of American sycamore, as you see here. So you have a lot of them on the ground. They help to suppress the weeds over time, and then with them on the ground also, they also help, they add carbon into the soil, biomass, and then they also improve the organisms, because they're well covered up. The organisms have more space, and they have more conducive environment benefits. Basically, they have more conducive environment to move around beneath the soil.
In closing, We're real excited about the research that we have done here in Butner, North Carolina, in Oxford, North Carolina, in Duplin County, in Wallace, North Carolina. And we're going to expand that research in the future with larger scale projects, partnering with farmers and industry, the wood pellet industry, to develop the science at scale. So what we mean by at scale is producing commercially relevant quantities of wood pellet bioenergy feedstocks to sell to large wood pellet manufacturers, and then we're going to do all of the economics that go along with that so that we can really quantify the benefits, the environmental and the economic benefits to rural North Carolina. As part of that, we use data from projects like this one in grant proposals that help us attract funding from primarily the U.S. Department of Agriculture so that we can do these larger scale projects. So the future is very bright for bioenergy in North Carolina.